Okay, so welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon, or wherever you are, good evening or good morning, to this year's Global Economy Lecture, together with our eminent speaker, Professor Partha Dasgupta. This Global Economy Lecture is co-organized by the Austrian Nationalbank and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And as an introduction, we're very happy to have Governor Holzmann here, who will give us some introductory words.
Thank you very much, Sir Dr. Stehrer, Professor Gupta, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this year's Global Economic Lecture, which is, as you already heard it, organized jointly by the Austrian National Bank and the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming a very distinguished speaker who will talk about an exciting, albeit unusual topic for economists. Partha Dasgupta is Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge with a focus on development and environmental economics. I think he is very well known for the much noticed Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, published earlier this year by the Treasury of the United Kingdom. This review sets out a framework on how to account for nature in economic science and policy. And it makes three basic recommendations. First, shifting economic activities towards economic-friendly activities. Second, investing in nature to raise its productive capacity. And third, investing in resource-efficient production. This review builds on previously published research on the population, consumption, environment nexus, a topic on which Professor Dasgupta will elaborate today. I would like to open the debate with a few ad hoc remarks. Maybe they lean a little bit on the skeptical side, but this only underlines my great interest in this issue. Let me be frank, as somebody who enjoys very much nature and everything nature has to offer, I am, if you want to, a true mountain boy or man. I'm still unsure whether central banks can effectively contribute to maintaining biodiversity. No doubt, the threatening extinctions of species has to do with economic activities, but in most cases, this cannot be tracked to macroeconomic monetary policy, but rather to structural reforms or the lack of them. The responsibility for those lies, however, with governments involving almost all ministries, regional authorities, and of course, local communities. One specific area of responsibility is also the fight against corruption. Think of the vested interest of big farmers and logging business in exploiting conservation areas, for instance, in the Amazonas. I think the recent days have been full, the debates across the world on that topic. And corruption has not been an issue in the national economic policy and development dialogue until James Wolferson introduced the C word at the World Bank, and this happened at the time when I joined him there. 2 decades later, one may be critical of what has been achieved, but at least there's now a sense of wrongdoing in the respective business, and they now need to consider the risks of prosecution. But the focus is increasingly shifting to the responsibility of financial markets and how they should price in nature in asset valuations. Yes, this requires a better understanding of economic mechanisms at work. And when it comes to environmentally justified financial regulation, the question arises of whether compliance regulation is A, feasible, B, effective, and C, efficient. The actual and potential use of nature for commercial ends may come into conflict with each other. I've recently overheard a mountain biologist being disapproving of mountain bikers. Frankly speaking, I love to bike in the mountains myself, especially in the mountains where I'm coming from, and the dedicated paths, not across the countryside. Tourism is one of the few sectors which is thriving in that region. Wouldn't it therefore be better to have tourists continue to come to the region, or thus help local population to enhance their livelihood? What else should people make their living from? Professor Dasgupta's speech will also focus on population developments. And since demography was part of a research to which I've contributed in the past, I'd like to make a few comments on that. The human population has crowded out other species and is set to continue to do so. There are now more than 7.7 billion of us, one of the few species that have similar successes in terms of the sheer numbers, namely chickens and ants, to name just two. Reassuringly, we have witnessed a peak of and at least a greater leveling off of human population growth in many regions of the world, and as indicated by the demographic transition model. Europe, China, Latin America, and much of East Asia are already reporting a negative demographic growth net of migration. But there's an important outlier, however. There are 1.1 billion people living in sub-Saharan Africa today, a figure that might double or more in the middle of next century. And according to the UN estimates, these figures may range between 3 and 4.5 billion human beings by the end of the century. They would thus account for the largest contribution to the world population, which forecasts a peak of 11 billion in 2100. The statistical explanation for this rise in the continent's population is an increasing life expectancy over recent decades that had not yet been matched fast enough by the observed falling birth rates. But we should not get trapped into a deterministic view of all those projections. Demographic transitions can be accelerated by empowering women, providing better health care and education, and investing in sustainable infrastructure. For instance, capital flows from the north to the south could finance solar and wind energy projects in part of Africa to benefit south as well as north. Now, let me come to our potential interest in the topic. Central banks are just about to understand the challenges of climate change and climate actions, both for price stability and financial system. We in the Eurosystem are committed to considering the impact of climate change in our monetary policy framework, our supervisory activities, as well as our own reserve portfolios investment. Of course, we do this in accordance with our mandate and without substituting the activities of governments primarily responsible. One may, however, wonder why we should now have to move to the next challenges of maintaining biodiversity before having hardly begun to act on climate issues. Honestly, I'm a bit hesitant. Yes, there are many synergies in tackling the two challenges, but they're also important trade-offs. Nevertheless, some analytical work is already in progress in central banks community. Reports of the Network for Greening the Financial System, the Nationalbank and the Banque de France try to capture the potential economic financial impacts of biodiversity loss. Admittedly, these impacts are complex and not yet fully understood. The reports provide first quantitative estimates of these dependencies of financial securities on the ecosystem services. suggesting at least 1/3 of financial securities is highly dependent. They also give an overview of involving central bank and private financial actors' activities regarding biodiversity issues. Let me clear, shedding light on the economics of biodiversity is very, very important. And I'm convinced that you, Professor Dasgupta, will provide us with many arguments which convince everyone. I'm honored to say the floor is yours. Thank you. And I give back the floor before to Robert Stehrer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Governor Holzmann, for this very interesting introduction already stepping a bit into maybe a discussion on the importance of this topic, but we will see later then on in the discussion with the audience. At this stage also, let me thank very much the Central Bank for this collaboration in organizing this Global Economy Lecture, which is now ongoing for more than 25 years, and I think always have addressed important topics for the world economy. So many thanks for this long-standing cooperation, which we do hope that it will continue for another decades. Well, Governor Holzmann, you already mentioned the importance in considering environmental topics and challenges, which maybe has not reflected so much in economic thinking, but one can easily hope that in future this becomes less unusual. And we do hope that such contributions as the Dasgupta report and others will contribute to that in various ways. Well, incidentally, you have seen that this lecture is taking place at the same time when the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COP26, is taking place in Glasgow, where also some of these important environmental challenges are discussed. But the impressive Dasgupta report, I think, goes even beyond some of these topics, addressing the issue of biodiversity and also the important notion of population change, which is, I think, an important question in this respect. Let me shortly introduce our today's speakers, Sir Professor Partha Dasgupta, which is not an easy task at all. Well, having read his CV, which amounts to 30 pages, it's very difficult to summarize. So I give only a very broad view of that. Well, in his career, Professor Dasgupta mostly commuted between his home country, India, and Cambridge in the UK, so Cambridge University in the UK, now being Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics, but he also held various positions in other institutions in countries like US in the Harvard University, in Stanford University, or also in the London School of Economics. He has been member and fellow or advisor to many economic societies or associations, journals, and so on, which are again much too numerous to be listed. And not surprisingly, Professor Dasgupta also published a large number of books and articles. Thanks to the fact that these are numbered in his CV, one can count more than 300 publications in all kind of renowned economic journals, but also in many other journals from other disciplines, together with about 25 books, which is a quite impressive record. And I personally can remember when being a young student and reading the impressive book on an inquiry into the well-being and destitution, which has been published in the beginning of the 1990s, which was at this time very impressive to me. And already in this book, environmental issues and resource management issues, mostly with respect to agriculture and food production, played a very important role, and it seems this topic has continued to the recent times as well. In his research, he covers many topics going from growth theory, development and poverty issues, welfare and justice, economic institutions, population policy, game theory, the impact of technological change, and of course, the topics we are talking about today on resource economics, sustainability, and environmental issues. Well, Professor Dasgupta has given a large number of special lectures, and so we are even more happy to also can hear your presentation today in our Global Economy lecture series. Before passing on the words to Professor Dasgupta, let me explain the structure of the event. The presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, which is followed by a hopefully lively discussion. For this discussion, please add your questions or comments into the chat function. Maybe it's easier if you try that it goes to everyone, as you can click on the right-hand side of the screen. And I will try to moderate these questions and pass on to Professor Dasgupta to maintain a lively discussion. So the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Stehrer and Dr. Holzmann, for your comment. Very welcoming introduction to me. It's an honor to be here, even though virtually, but we have now got used to the virtual world. In fact, it'll be very awkward to meet from now on when you're giving lectures, because we won't know quite what to do. Not so long ago, the economic questions requiring urgent attention could be studied by excluding nature from formal economic reasoning, as it made economic sense to focus on the accumulation of produced capital, which are roads, buildings, ports, and machines, and human capital, health and education. Unfortunately, the resulting macroeconomic models of growth and development so directed the way economists in academia, national governments, and international organizations collect and analyze data today that it has become a commonplace that we can bypass nature in our economic lives. This is a profound error. It may have been justifiable, say, 70 years ago, and I'll show you the significance of the post-war period. It's certainly not pertinent today. It's a big mistake. Nature is our home, our most precious asset. We are embedded in nature. We are part of nature. So the human economy is embedded in nature. So to imagine that nature is infinitely large, so we can ignore it, its price, accounting price, if you like, is negligible, is just wrong. The belief that we can bypass nature has been strengthened by the fact that the average person today enjoys a far higher income, is less likely to be in absolute poverty, and lives significantly longer than she did even 70 years ago. Since 1950, the global expectancy of life at birth has risen from 46 years to 73 years. Moreover, the world economy has grown more than 15-fold to over $130 trillion GDP a year at purchasing power parity. May I have a look at the first slide, please? Now, if you look at figure 1, which plots real GDP, global GDP in purchasing power parity, from 1750 to 2019, you will see a very familiar hockey stick shape. It barely grows till about 1900, takes off a bit, but about 1950, that's my 70-year period. In other words, roughly speaking, my generation's lifespan, it really shot up from about 2.2 to about 17-fold from 1950 to 2019. Moreover, global per capita income has increased more than 5-fold to over $17,000 PPP per year. May I have the second figure, please? And you see a rather similar shaped curve. That is, it didn't grow very much until about 1900. And then from 1950, it's shot up again, increased by more than 5-fold. So the third figure will give you, of course, the population growth rate. If I may have the third figure, please. Yes, and there again you will see there are more than 5.3 billion more people today to enjoy that increase in the standard of living. For today's population is 7.8 billion. And as you can see, 1950 is again, roughly speaking, a turning point. The health system is so much better. Antibiotics are a prominent example, reason for declines in mortality. That wasn't followed by a comparable fertility decline. So of course the population took over. These three figures that I've shown you are actually very consistent with what earth scientists have found and ecologists have found from their kind of data, which is the health of ecosystems in the latter case, and in the former case were earth scientists' signatures in the archaeological record of very key elements like phosphorus and so forth in the earth system. That things have really shot up in a big way. And the idea that I want to explore is human activity relative to nature's ability to support those activities. But these three figures, as I say, are symptomatic of a trend that has taken place over the past 200 years, really shooting up in the last 70 years, so much so that earth scientists today, many of them anyway, have chosen 1950 approximately as the point at which we have entered the era of the Anthropocene. A familiar term to you all, no doubt, but perhaps you might have asked, when did we enter it? And one view is that it's about at the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the post-war period. And these three figures, of course, display that. So it would seem as though we have been living at the very best of times. And undoubtedly, my generations have had it very well. The average person now, I'm not including now the distributional issues, I'm talking about the global average. But we have enjoyed economic growth by accumulating produced capital and human capital at the expense of what we may call natural capital, what I've been calling nature so far. We have done that by decumulating the biosphere, for example, by degrading, even destroying ecosystems. So although my review was on the economics of biodiversity, very quickly in the review, I argued that we ought to be studying ecosystems because they are capital assets. And biodiversity is simply well, I wouldn't say simply, but is a characteristic of ecosystems. It's a flavor of an ecosystem. And as I say, the past 70 years in particular, there has been a ferocious accumulation of produced capital and human capital, and I'll show it in a minute, but a decumulation of natural capital. One study sponsored by UNEP has found that during 1992-2014, produced capital per capita globally doubled and human capital per capita increased by 15%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. May I please have the fourth figure, please? Figure 4. Thank you. In figure 4, I've drawn from 1992 to 2014, 3 curves, time series of produced capital, top human capital, next one, natural capital, the bottom, and you can see that its natural capital has declined. It's a very succinct way of showing that in recent decades, there has been an imbalance in the accumulation and decumulation of the 3 kinds of capital assets that I'm talking about in this lecture. One has declined and the others have increased. So of course you would imagine that the relative price, the accounting price of natural capital relative to produced and human capital must be increasing because the ratios are now different. In short, the demands we have made of nature's goods and services have for some decades exceeded her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. Because the difference between demand and sustainable supply is met by a diminution of labor, of nature, the gap has been increasing, threatening our descendants' lives. We have been collectively damaging nature at an alarming rate, with biodiversity declining faster than at any time in human history. Such degradation of nature can have dire consequences for our economies, our livelihoods, and well-being. COVID-19 has shown us what might be just the tip of the iceberg if we continue the manner of our current engagement with nature. By one inevitably very crude estimate, the ratio of demand to sustainable supply is today approximately 1.6, which provides the image that we need 1.6 Earth to meet our current demand. It would seem then that we are also living at the very worst of times. Nature is an asset, like produced capital and human capital. I've been calling it natural capital. But like education and health, nature is not merely an economic good. We all rely on the goods and services nature supplies, but nature's worth goes far beyond its use value. And although I'll be talking about use value today, there are other values that we ascribe to nature or impute to nature. Aspects of it have intrinsic, even sacred value. Once we include these aspects of nature in our lives, the economics of biodiversity becomes a study in portfolio management, which is why I perhaps am slightly in disagreement with Dr. Holzmann, who in his very illuminating remarks suggested that the central banks perhaps won't have much to do with this area. He was obviously making a point of discussion, but I think I would disagree to the extent that it's a portfolio problem. It so happens that many of these assets of natural capital don't have markets, so they are free. And if they're free, the idea isn't then that we ignore it. We ask ourselves how to change our institutions such that we feel their price, their worth, so that we pay for it when we use it. Now, I've talked about the demand and supply difference, and that's why I want to focus now on that issue. Nature supplies us with enormous numbers of services. Just to mention a few, pollination is one. Degradation of our waste is another. Very, very powerful service that she provides, because if that didn't happen, we would be swamped with debris and be dead. Oh, the biosphere would collapse, at least in the form that we know it. Offers us nitrogen fixation, fixes the climate, or regulates the climate, which we have disturbed. And as Professor Stehrer just mentioned, the COP26 is underway, started day before yesterday, and it's concerned with the imbalance in the climate regulation that our activities have created. And of course, the climate problem can be seen as a reduction in the capacity of an extraordinarily important asset, namely the atmosphere, to cope with the pollutant that we're emitting into it. And in this case, of course, the pollutant at the present moment is carbon. So that the rest of the biosphere has to adjust. And of course, it's being disturbed in such a way that climate imbalance is causing imbalances elsewhere as well. And I'll come back to that. So I want to talk now for the rest of this lecture on the gap between what we demand from nature and what nature is capable of supplying on a sustainable basis. Now, I mentioned already a whole variety of services that Mother Nature offers us, many of which we cannot see and we cannot hear. And that's extremely important because, of course, it means that it gets missed. Think of all the processes that are taking place under our feet in the soils or in the depth of the forest, in the Amazon and so forth. All that huge factory at work producing, churning out goods and services which eventually end up in one form or the other in our food, in our timber, in the fibers that we consume, we make use of, and the water we consume, the clean water we consume, and so forth. So I want to look at this imbalance between demand and supply. Now, it is the case, of course, that there are many, many such services. And so the relationship between demand and supply really should be a vector of relationships. Okay, but I'm going to, for this topic, for this purpose, ignore the vectorness of it and imagine that we do have a weighting system, maybe with accounting prices, such that we can convert our demand into a scalar measure and our supply in the form of a scalar measure. May I have the 5th slide, please? And what I've done here is to think of, first of all, the left-hand side, namely the demand that we're making at any moment in time. This is a snapshot, okay? And what we have been pointing to is the fact that there is a gap between demand and supply. Demand exceeds supply, which is, of course, being shown by a growing imbalance between the various forms of capital assets. Now, what might that demand mean? Human activity. Well, one measure of human activity, I think the most common measure would be GDP, because it's the market value of final products. And so I'm going to assume that GDP is going to be can be a reasonable indicator of our activities. And it's not a bad idea to do that, because if GDP is proportional to our activities, then the fact that it's not actually our activity, but a proportion of it, then the growth rates of the two will be the same. So we won't lose very much by looking at GDP alone. Okay. So GDP, what I've done is to have thought in terms of converting the GDP in terms of the resources that are used indirectly into the into the production of GDP. So I need a conversion factor, okay, in terms of nature's goods and services. And I'm going to call that conversion factor alpha. It's the index of efficiency, the efficiency with which we translate or we convert nature's goods and services into final product. And therefore now I can have, armed with these symbols, I can write GDP, for example, as the total population and multiplied by the per capita GDP, which I'm writing as small y, and then n times y. N is, if n is global population, n times y, which is the numerator on the left-hand side of that inequality in the Earth's in the circle there. Then ny divided by alpha is the demand we are making. Okay, and on the right-hand side is the supply. So imagine, think of the supply of all the goods and services Mother Nature offers us as though it were a fishery. So each year there is a production of biomass in the fishery, and the human economy takes our fish out. If the amount that is drawn out is greater than the reproductive rate of the biomass, then of course the fishery draws down. I want you to think of it that way on the right-hand side. So G is the supply of goods and services that Mother Nature offers us, and capital S, which is within brackets there, is, if you like, an index of the stock of the biosphere. So if the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side, then of course it can maintain that only by drawing down capital S, the stock. That's the adjustment mechanism, which is consistent with whatever all the diagrams I've shown you, at least the previous diagram, namely we're eating into nature. So long as this inequality holds, we're in trouble. And it can't hold forever, because in finite time, there will be real serious breakdown, which is of course what is being discussed at COP15, and next year in China, COP26 now, and in China in COP15 on the economics of on biodiversity. Okay, so what I want to do now is to talk a little bit about this inequality and how the global discussion has been undertaken. Two methods could be in principle used to close the gap between demand and supply. If the idea behind sustainable development is to make this impact in what I'm calling the impact inequality into an equality, then either the right-hand side has to increase, or the left-hand side has to decrease, or both. Okay. Turning to the right-hand side is pretty straightforward. All the suggestions have been that we ought to invest in nature. Okay, so the current discussions on nature-based solutions or investing in nature, planting trees and so forth and so on, is really concerned with the right-hand side lifting it up, increase the stock. And in the climate case, of course, increasing the stock means its ability to absorb carbon of trees and so forth, okay? So that's the right-hand side. It's the left-hand side I want to talk about. It's interesting that pretty much in all our discussions to date, attention has been focused on small y and alpha. Alpha in particular in the climate case, because of course alpha is an index of the efficiency with which we make use of nature's goods and services into producing final products. And in the case of climate change, the natural thought has been move away from fossil fuels to clean energy, which would mean alpha will rise, increase in value, numerical value, and the higher it is, the lower will be the left-hand side. And one of the, I think, perhaps puzzling and worrying aspect of the received economics of climate change has been that because there is an obvious way to reduce our demand on nature, so far as climate regulation is concerned, namely a move from fossil fuels to clean energy, it suggests that we can get away with it by bringing the inequality into inequality without having to reduce small y. So economic growth, as we now know it, is not to be jeopardized because we can invest in our way out of the problem. And I think that has been a big mistake. It's been a mistake because carbon regulation or climate regulation is only one of the many services Mother Nature offers us, and equally important, next point, namely all the ones I mentioned in my talk earlier, previously, all the services that she provides, they're complementary to each other. They're not substitutes, and certainly not independent. So if one of them is pushed down too hard, it will reverberate onto the other services. Just as climate change would have huge implications on the other services, the other services in turn had enormous influence on the climate. You could consider, for example, if nitrogen fixation was compromised. If that were compromised, many other things would fall. And the one factor which has been missing in pretty much all is capital N, namely population. And I cannot understand quite why, and Dr. Holzmann was very acute in making the observation that he did about the importance of population and the fact that we have enjoyed, large parts of the world have enjoyed a fertility transition. So what I want to do now is to talk, the rest of my talk, the next 10 minutes, I want to concentrate on small n, and as Dr. Holzmann did, focus on the one part of the world which I think faces serious problems in the future unless they take population seriously. And I will talk in terms of the kinds of policy measures that can be taken, which are so very much connected with empowering women. So I'm in a safe area of discourse, but it has huge ramifications for the prospects of our friends and colleagues in sub-Saharan Africa. May I have the sixth figure, please? Dr. Holzmann mentioned the UN projections, and here they are. The United Nations Population Division's projections from 1950 to 2100, broken up into various regions. As you can see, the top region, the blue region, is sub-Saharan Africa, and of course I'll be concentrating on that for the moment. Population today is about 7.8 billion. These are the median estimates of the United Nations. We can talk about the 95% error bars and so forth later on in discussion if you're so inclined, but I'm going to stick to now the median projections. And the median projection for 2100 globally is 10.9 billion. So we are looking at an increase of 3.1 billion from now to the end of the century. Median, again, median, okay? Of them, notice that if you look at all the other colors, by about 2050, the curves are showing declines. So the fertility transition has occurred, as Dr. Holzmann rightly pointed out, in Eastern Asia, East Asia, Europe, of course, the United States, and so forth. But they're all coming down from then. And so the gap, the increase that we're expecting, huge increase, will be, at the end of the day, due to Sub-Saharan Africa, where the population currently is about 1.2 billion, a bit less than that. And the median projection is 3.8 billion in year 2100, which is an increase of 2.6 billion. In a continent, you must bear in mind, where average income is a quarter of the average global income. Now, it should make absolutely clear, the GDP of Sub-Saharan Africa today is even now about 3 to 4 or 5% of global GDP. So if GDP is used as our index on economic activity, as I have been doing so far, there is no question that that region is not responsible for the global problems that we face regarding climate change, biodiversity loss, and so forth, because she's too tiny economically. The problem I'm going to be talking about is what portends in the future. And the way to interpret these diagrams is to think in terms of fertility rates, which I will do in a minute. But bear in mind one caveat I want to bring to your attention first. A cocktail party response. Every time I raise these issues, say at cocktail parties or at a dinner party, or because people are interested, I move in academic circles and people are interested in what I'm working on, and when I point out to these issues, they say, well, we shouldn't be too worried because we are told that population is flattening out, maybe even dipping in the future. So why worry? The reason we should be worried is that Mother Nature, and if you look at the impact inequality I just now mentioned, it's demand and supply. Okay, demand for what we're taking out from nature and its ability to supply them at that point. And if it's not able to do that, it's brought down, which means that we're not looking at the rate of change of demand. We're looking at the demand itself. Mother Nature does not respond to first derivative. She doesn't respond to the second derivative. What she's responding to is the actual demand we make. So the fact that down the road, there will be a flattening of these curves, maybe even a dip, is not really a source of comfort if meanwhile we've already damaged the biosphere even further. So you do bear that in mind, that there may be problems afoot waiting to explode if there are tipping points, for example, as earth scientists are telling us about the Earth system, which is highly nonlinear. So I'm going to give you some statistics on this. The total fertility rate in Sub-Saharan Africa today is 4.6. In Austria, it's well below 2. Well below 2, because the fertility transition, for those who are not acquainted with these notions, fertility transition is really fertility rate hitting about 2.1, which will be the replacement level. So that in the long run, if you have about 2.1, give or take the percentage, the decimal point, 2.1, then in the long run, you'll have a stable population. 4.6 is, of course, quite high. Converted, it currently 2.6% growth rate of population in Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to give you a simple example of how problematic these issues are. Nigeria currently has a population of 200 million, and the UNPD's projection for 2050, not 2100, 2050, in other words, 30 years from now, is 400 billion. That is to say, it's going to double its population in the next 30 years. TFR there is 5.4. And so we have a problem. We have a problem, or rather, they have a problem. One reason they have a problem is the following. If you're a very poor country and relying on your ecosystems, as is the case with the world's poorest countries, because the world's poorest countries also happen to live in the tropics. happen to be located in the tropics. And the tropics are, of course, the home of the greatest biodiversity on Earth, the richest flora and fauna, generating so much of the services that you and I enjoy, because these are global public goods, like climate regulation, the transport of goods and services through the movement of nature's activities, wind, ocean currents, rivers, and so forth, which is churning out and creating a global atmosphere in which we all live. Now, in that kind of a world, the natural tendency, of course, would be, actually, if you're very poor, it's exactly right to try and improve the standard of living. And the economic models that we have shaped urge countries to start exporting products in order to be able to earn income for investment purposes and so forth. These are the standard arguments that we read, and they follow directly from economic modeling. The problem is that because so much of nature is unpriced, comes at zero price, the exports of primary products from the poor countries to the rich countries carry with them a hidden subsidy, because many of the prices are not included in the export prices. Many of the inputs that are going to the export of the goods are not priced, which is really perverse, because it says that when a poor country exports primary products to a rich country, essentially a certain amount of wealth is being lost by the poor country and transferred to the rich country. And this is not necessarily, this is not a criticism of the system, in the sense that it's not necessarily a conscious thing. In fact, most people haven't even noticed this fact. Whenever I've lectured on it, they say, oh my gosh, we didn't know about this, because we are told trade is a very good thing. Free trade improves everybody. Well, it has problems, because free trade is a good thing, is efficient, if every commodity has a market. But the reason we are discussing biodiversity loss and climate change is that many of these goods don't have markets. So in some sense, the conventional story of trade is really flawed, because we've got a flawed model, economic model, on which we build our policies. Now, sometimes, so you can see, we have the reason I worry about sub-Saharan Africa is that in sub-Saharan African future, I have so many friends there, their children and their grandchildren and so forth, is that they're very poor. And the need in a rising population, in a huge population, rising population, requires them to export even more, then it will be almost like a vicious circle of a deteriorating landscape, deforestation, for example, greater mining, creating more pollution, making lives so much more miserable for people, the poorer people, poorest people there, and subsequently. These are reasons why population issue is important. And yet, of course, population is not on the agenda of public discourse. I've at either COP15 or COP26, and since the publication of my review, I've had many discussions and organized by the UK Treasury, events in which I've given lectures like today, and also answers Q&A sessions and so forth, with decision makers, leaders, political leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a uniform understanding amongst the elite of the world that population is not to be discussed. One reason for that is a fear of cultural intrusion. And that's a very legitimate one. Obviously, we should not intrude into cultural things. But as an economist, as a social scientist, we mustn't assume things without staring at it in the face, if you see what I mean. And I'm increasingly convinced from the data, and I'll end with these thoughts, that culture is not immutable. People respond to incentives and try and make the best of their lives as far as they can do, for their children, for their wives and husbands, for their families, and for the greater community, maybe even. But we respond. And so to use culture as a way of blocking discussion seems to me to be anti-science. You see what I mean? And certainly not humane. And I want to give you an example from a modern day. In fact, Dr. Holzmann already has talked about how 40, 50 years ago, countries in the Far East, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, which also at that time were seen to be very conservative societies, conservative in the sense of, well, in the sense that we use the term these days in being conservative in their ways of life and so forth. That was a traditional statement in those days, but they went through the fertility transition because they took it seriously. And in our own time, one of the poorest countries of the world, Bangladesh, has shown us something to me, very interesting and revealing. In 1971, if you remember, Pakistan split into West Pakistan, and West Pakistan split and East Pakistan separated into two different countries. One is Pakistan now, and Bangladesh on the other hand. At the time of partition, 1971, what is now Pakistan was 40% richer than Bangladesh at that time, what became Bangladesh. Richer in terms of per capita GDP, of course. Okay. The fertility rate in Bangladesh was 6.9 then. The fertility rate in Pakistan was 6.6, so slightly lower. Today, Pakistan is about 30% poorer than Bangladesh. And Bangladesh's fertility rate is 2, whereas Pakistan remains at 3.4. The point about this is Bangladesh was a very conservative society, and in some ways it still is. And we are all conservative in some direction and not conservative in others. So I'm not suggesting there is anything new about this. We all have our things that we want to preserve and resist change for a variety of reasons, and that's how we are. We are humans. But for reasons I still have not understood, and I have asked my friends because it's to me intriguing, a huge attempt was made from the 70s onwards, small pilot studies and large-scale experiments, the famous Matlab-Tana experiment in family planning and reproductive health services offered to households, not just women, but households, involving males, involving local leaders, village leaders, and a discussion of the merits of allowing women control over their bodies, so that help with information about how to do so, which is what I'm talking about, family planning and reproductive health. At the moment, something happened, and the result is, of course, we have seen the fertility transition take place over the past couple of decades in Bangladesh as a result, which suggests to me, again, that these social norms are not immutable. Today, the World Bank says, estimates that there is more than 220, the United Nations estimates that there are more than 220 million women in their reproductive ages who have no access to family planning devices, modern family planning devices, and reproductive health measures, which of course, I don't have to belabor why this is so flies against the face of our desire that women are empowered. One thought about women's empowerment is that education is the key. And that has become the modern thought, the contemporary thinking, that the way to bring about the fertility transition is women's education. And there is, of course, a great deal of truth in that, and it's correct. We should. That goes without saying. That will empower women too. The one problem is, it's not either or. I think that both need to be handled together. One reason is that education is extremely expensive to bring about. By that I don't mean financial terms, but that education institutions require several complementary inputs. You need a building, a schoolroom, a school. You need equipment, you need teachers, and you need the teachers to show up to teach. And there's plenty of evidence of each of these bottlenecks or any of these bottlenecks not taking place. And therefore, it hasn't really been as successful as perhaps planners have thought it would be. Currently, the World Bank estimates about a third of the women in the poorer world between the ages of 15 and 24, which is, of course, the population group that the education movement has targeted, are still illiterate. So we shouldn't put all our attention on education as a means of both empowering women and bringing about a fertility transition, because it's not quite as low-hanging a fruit as fertility, as family planning and reproductive health measures. So I leave you with these thoughts. There are many, many alternative and parallel policies that we ought to think in terms of to bring this impact inequality to an equality. And the reason I've focused on population today, and also that in one part of the world, is that that's one variable which is missing in the discussions that are taking place these days in Glasgow and will take place next year in China. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Professor Dasgupta, for this very interesting insights, maybe a bit gloomy insights as well for the coming years or decades to come. So I ask the audience whether there are some questions. So if so, please enter into the chat and we will follow them. As there is no immediate question arising here, maybe I pose one question, which is, of course, I'm interested in. Meaning, in your talk, you gave the idea that the things we took out from nature and the running down of the natural capital stock is mostly driven by the developed countries. Whereas a lot of your talk in the end, the emphasis has been on the population growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, which are not responsible, so to say, for this running down of the natural capital stock. So I wondered whether this would be enough, say, even this say fertility transition would take place there. Would that be enough to keep the balance or to transmit the balance into demand more or less equals supply? Or would there have been other important policy issues to hold this rising gap between the demand and supply for the world as a whole, and particularly for the developed countries?
Well, thank you very much. That's a very, very good question, and it needed to be asked because I obviously did not emphasize it. The answer is yes, absolutely. This is just one little slither of a policy issue that I discussed today. And because it matters very deeply to the poorest people. But this gap will not be changed by anything by family planning, I assure you. That if it is exactly right that people, in COP26, there is so much talk now of trying to move faster to clean energy, namely raising alpha, increasing alpha so that the demand is reduced. Currently, and interestingly, as you know from the newspaper reports, the COP26, actually I'll be going there the day after tomorrow to take part in an event with Inger Anderson, who is the chief of the United Nations Environment Program, and Nick Stern, who produced the Economics of Climate Change for the UK Treasury some 13 years ago. So we'll be involved in that. The interesting development that's taking place in COP26, as far as I can understand, is also that they're reviving the idea that the tropical rainforests need protection. So that's also one in which the capital F, as pertains to tropical rainforests, ought not to be allowed to continue to shrink the way they have. So that measure is moving in the direction of trying to keep the right-hand side from going down further. So there's that. And of course, there are other institutional changes that people are trying to come into to discuss, which indirectly affect alpha. Remember, these variables are not independent of each other. I've just written them down as though they look independent. Of course, they're not. If you affect alpha, it will affect small y. If you affect small y, it will affect alpha and and also capital G and so forth. I mean, these are all, you have to write down a dynamic model with interdependencies. And I've done that in my review. There is a whole chapter on it, to a formal dynamic model, which could be used to substitute for the growth and development models that government departments, including your own department in your own government, use. So these are related. So I'm not suggesting that they are independent of each other. It's just that the focus, they're speaking to different aspects of life. So COP26, COP15, these are, the attention is towards the richer countries, that's for sure. And the agreement, the tentative agreement again, that there'll be about $100 billion a year of assistance to poor countries to cope with climate change, is also designed to keep their small y's from going down further, or going their small y. So yes, there is the discussion is around this small y, alpha, G, and S. And what I was trying to do was to say there are some things that you can do with regard to capital N, which would be could be very particularly pertinent for the world's poorest countries, their future, their grandchildren's future. So that's the reason for my focusing on N.
Okay, thank you. So I think there are some questions now in the chat as well. I think the first question of Michael Landesmann is also along these lines on my question, that he finds it difficult to disagree with your emphasis on the family planning and education in relation to this parameter N. The second question is, and I try to combine two of them, I think it's more a technical question. Well, given that you say that these important natural assets do not have a price, how one would do that to attach prices to them, to the services of nature? And if so, and nature would have a certain correct price, well, there would be, is another question, there would be some profit-seeking enterprises to invest in that. But what do you think about the non-profitable investments like biodiversity, which would not generate profits as a whole for private enterprises? So how you intend to put prices on that and to give sort of rents to them?
Very good question again, and it's very hard to answer in a very short way. I just ask you to remind yourself of basic economics. So you're looking at a case where, let us say, at an extreme, a commodity has a zero price, whereas its shadow price should be positive. Okay, in the market it's zero, but its shadow price or accounting price is positive. How do you bring that positive into account? Well, one way would be, of course, for the state to intervene and tax the use of that to the point at which it's tax it to the point that the price that you pay is the accounting price. So that's a state solution to it. Small communities have done other things. They have had command and control, social norms of behavior, keeping the demand of their local ecosystems within the supply range of those local ecosystems. There's a huge literature on that. But more importantly, in my experience over the past 9 months of daily, pretty much daily on weekdays, events with private sector parliamentarians, NGOs, and so forth that the Treasury has organized for me, continues to this day. The private sector has been extremely interesting. The financial sector in particular, is that the people I've met have been extremely interesting because they have observed the following facts, and that will give you a clue. After all, what we are looking for is the productivity of ecosystems, remember. So the ecosystem may be free in the sense that market price is zero, but that doesn't mean that we can't figure out, when I say we, you'll need ecologists, of course. It's not going to be economists on their own. It has to be ecologists because they understand the processes that are guiding, that are driving the ecosystem, and the relationship between that ecosystem in question, let's say a coral reef or a mangrove forest. Those are ecosystems of great productivity, and you need to know what their productivity is. That is, what services are they conferring on the population next door? So let's take a simple example of a mangrove forest. What does a mangrove forest do for you? Well, there are at least 3 service is that it provides the local population. One, it protects them from storms, from disaster. It reduces the risk of their house being devastated by a storm surge. Okay, so that's one. And of course, now there's plenty of work trying to figure out the benefits, financial benefits of that happening, the reduction in risk due to mangroves. One way you do that is to compare the devastation, the frequency of devastation that takes place in villages which have mangroves against those which don't have mangroves to support them. The standard ways of doing it. Okay, so that's one. Second, it's a spawning ground for fisheries. Well, fish are marketed. So in principle, you can figure out the loss in revenues due to a destruction of the mangroves. So that's the second. And a third would be, of course, the timber used for building material and so forth. And again, timber has a market price. So you could use that again. So there are ways now. There's a big literature amongst ecological economists in trying to tease out the productivity, in other words, the shadow prices of these ecosystems. That's why it's not so much biodiversity, it's ecosystems as assets which we should be valuing. Okay. So now, about the private sector, why are they interested in it? Well, they're interested in it because take a firm which imports primary products from Africa and then converts them into finished products and sells it to your supermarkets in Austria. Now that firm is worried, is increasingly worried, if all the discussions I've had with financial companies are to be believed, are to be taken seriously. They're concerned that if there is serious biodiversity loss, i.e., productivity loss of the ecosystems from which they're taking their primary products, then their profits are endangered. Okay, what can they do about it? Well, one thing is take those ecosystems seriously. Do not exploit them. The problem is that those ecosystems are related to other ecosystems in the neighborhood. As I said, nature is an interconnected mess. And some other company, which is maybe competing against you, it also has primary products from the neighboring ecosystem. And that company is also facing this risk, additional risk due to ecosystem degradation. The problem is that these risks are correlated, positively correlated. So if my rivals, my other companies' profits risks increase, so are mine, because we have a common source, common related source of primary products. What does that suggest to you? It suggests that firms ought to take now collective action to ensure that those are not the risk is diluted. So there are gains to be had from firms collectively working together to preserve the ecosystems on which their profits lie. Now, of course, there's the standard argument that CEOs are very short-sighted often, and we're looking at the long run, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, which may be beyond the CEO's eyesight, so to speak. But that's where we as consumers come in. The more we care about Mother Nature in a visceral kind of way, in an emotional kind of way, the more we will demand that firms behave. And so I think there is hope. You began, Professor Stehrer, that it was a pessimistic story. But yes, we are facing crisis. No question about it, in my judgment. We cannot avoid it by saying that the world is okay. It's not. We are in trouble. But we have to find our way out. And I think there are ways out. If we care about it and we insist that firms behave, how do they do that? How do we verify that they are behaving? By insisting that they disclose their activities right from the source, entire supply chain, from source to sink. Now, in one way, all of my friends in Austria, you all insist on disclosure from firms. When you buy a food product in the supermarket and look at the package, it'll tell you what it contains, how much sugar, fat, salt, and so forth. Why? 50 years ago, they didn't do that. Today you do, because we care about our health and we have our purse, and we say we're not going to buy it unless you tell me what I'm consuming. So that's where the pressure will ultimately come from, has to come from. And I think there is if you like, a convergence of interest. The consumer, or us, we citizens, care. If we care about nature, we will want to do something about it, but we can't do it on our own. we need to put pressure on governments to insist that these disclosures are made. And disclosure, of course, is in the interest of the firms to disclose for the simple reason that they tie their hands in order to make more profits. So disclosure here is a substitute for missing markets. That's the key thing here. And I think I've been very encouraged in these past months in discussing these matters with the private sector, in realizing that we are speaking a common language. I don't know if this helps, but that's where my thinking goes now.
Okay, thank you. I think that the big question is whether this will be quick enough. But before answering this question, I have been notified that Governor Holzmann has raised his hands and want to say something. So I couldn't see that on my screen, but please, Mr. Holzmann, go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. First of all, congrats, Mr. Dasgupta. It was a great speech, and I didn't know what you were talking about. And I thought I would provoke with my link to demography and found out that I think we have very much the same thoughts, that demography is a very important driver of the investment in biodiversity. As I've worked also in Africa, I had the experiences there with policymakers and also comparison, let's say, between Sri Lanka and Tanzania, which are probably the same level of economic welfare at the time of decolonization, the early of the 60s. And again, Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, had a totally different demographic policy compared to Tanzania. And now the difference is much larger than what you said between Bangladesh and Pakistan. And when I inquired into that, of course, policy making, politicians play a huge role. In Africa, it is that policymakers encourage population because they have the old belief of, I would say, 19th century Europe. In order to win over your neighbors, you have to have a strong population. It's still there, so you have the policymaker there. But beyond that, there's even more so that my assessment is that, religious institutions, very big ones, are very much against any kind of discussion of control of the population. Now, my question to you is, it's not an economic one, because I think the economic possibilities and constraints are known. It's the question, how can one bring the issue to a level where we have now climate change? Climate change a number of years ago, 10, 15 years, was more the field of a limited number of encouraged people who did it. Nowadays, it has at least a worldwide recognition. Is there a way, out of your experience, since you're close to policymakers now, to say we also need to bring the politicians the issue of demography nearby, because otherwise our fight for climate will be difficult, our fight for biodiversity will be difficult, and also our fight against other diseases like war and increase in prosperity for everybody will be under threat. So it's a not negligible topic. It's not a side topic. It's one of the critical topics which doesn't get any attention at the moment in the policy circle. So my question to you, a simple one, what can be done? Thank you.
The question is a very simple one, but the answer is impossibly hard because I can't, let me just very briefly touch upon it. There is resistance, you're absolutely right. And it's resistance, you're quite right that there is an idea that, you know, if my tribe's number or my group's number increases relative to the others, I have an advantage. And that's absolutely right. So we have like a prisoner's dilemma kind of a game that's going on. Absolutely right. Quite so. The problem is that with a huge growth in youth numbers, finding employment becomes so much more difficult, particularly given the pressure on the local ecosystem, which is what I was highlighting in my lecture. so that you get into this kind of a trap. So it's not really good for the future, for the people in power either. The one thing I've discovered, and that is, I'm afraid, a pessimistic thing, is that we have become the leaders that I've spoken to on population matters, they all speak the same language. Doesn't matter whether they're from Africa, whether they're from Asia, whether they're from, you name it. They speak the same language as the ones in Europe, in the UK, for example, because they're a homogeneous crowd. They know each other. They've all, been educated these are the elite. They've been educated in the top universities in the West, and they've gone back and now become ministers or heads of banks or the heads of international agencies and so forth. I mean, your own experience will tell you that what I'm saying has a resonance to what you're saying. And so it's penetrating this, and there, of course, there's national pride involved, and there's a history of the discussions, so that, is this an imperial, is this a colonial attitude and so forth. That's why I'm at pains. I have one advantage. I don't come from a colonial power. I'm Indian by birth, so that's one reason I think I'm entitled to go on talking about it without being attacked immediately. But that said, I really emphasize all the time that I'm looking at it from the point of view of young Africans of the future. I'm not talking about the interest of the West. I really am talking, and it's a small part of the world, but of course it's becoming a larger part because of population growth. There'll be about 20% of the population at the end of the century, 25% of the population, 20% of the world's population by the end of the century, more than 20%, sorry, about its projection. So that's not negligible. And if the large-scale social problems arising out of endemic poverty, arising of the pressure on their resources, then we have a security problem too. But I'm not optimistic that this will get onto the agenda. That's probably, but still, as a scientist, if I can only introduce themes and see how far we can go. Nothing more. Well, thank you for asking the question, though.
Okay, thank you. There are two further sets of questions from the chat, and I think these are the closing questions because we are already advanced in time. So the first question from Charlie Bichelman and also from Michael is, meaning on this transition, one might expect that say that the small y, the GDP per capita in the sub-Saharan African countries might rise because there might be this catching up process and this becoming much more prosperous, and maybe this goes faster than the flattening out of the population rise. What would be the plausible paths then for this population increases or fertility rates and the alpha, this technical parameter in this region to compensate for this GDP per capita increases, which might be expected from simple growth theoretical considerations?
Right. It's again, remember, the growth theoretical considerations come out of models which don't have natural capital in it. That's why I'm very skeptical about economic forecasts that are built without nature in them. Because no matter how much statistical econometric regressions you run, if the model is wrong, your analysis is wrong. Your predictions are going to be wrong. The policies you come up with are going to be wrong. And since in the last 70 years, we've shifted to a world in which you cannot afford to ignore natural capital in the production side of things, I think this is extremely important. Okay, but saying that, all right, so small y increases in Africa, somehow or the other, by hook or by crook. I think the scope of alpha increasing directly through technological change is small when you come to those aspects of Mother Nature which are outside, which are connected with biodiversity. Not climate. Climate is the one real exception where you have a visible transformation of technology from clean to dirty to clean, if you like, raising alpha. But when it comes to biodiversity loss, nature solutions are going to dominate over technological solutions. All the examples that we have seen now recently. The studies have been, I can't, my review, which is 600 pages long, has a huge number of references, and they will tell you that it's not a closed door, goes without saying, but it's a resistant door that resists. So where does the alpha come from? Changes in alpha come from? It will of course come through indirectly if you get your institutions right. So for example, we have the open ocean, and I'd be very interested in what Dr. Holzmann has to say on this. The open seas are costless. We don't pay. Nobody pays for all the transport that takes place across the Pacific, Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. All the container ships. We're looking at trillions of dollars of merchandise traveling. Okay, and then there's of course fisheries as well. Small amount GDP in comparison to GDP, but extremely dangerous in terms of Mother Nature because the trawlers really go down and basically sweep the floors and ruin biodiversity there. And the oceans are used also as a dumping ground for plastics and all that, in the refuse that comes out of the sea, from the rivers into the oceans. Now, none of this is charged. So it's a zero price commodity. Should we not charge them for it? They're open access, so it belongs to humanity. It belongs to us all and therefore belongs to nobody. That's the sort of tragedy of the commons kind of problem. Shouldn't we be charging for it? Shouldn't we insist that they pay? And that's again not under discussion in COP26. And one of the things I proposed in the review was the creation of an international institution like the World Bank and the IMF for providing this protection for this huge global public good that are the open oceans. So some payment for this ecosystem service that the oceans offer us should be paid for, and that payment should be collected by humanity at large for other purposes. If that happens, of course, then transportation becomes more costly, right? And therefore, it affects alpha. Alpha increases because institutional reform is, of course, a method of changing the efficiency with which we use nature's goods and services into final product. And of course, it'll make small y a little lower, or maybe not little, because you will be paying a bigger price. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing I think I'd like to end by saying that I would not like to, I think it's a bad idea to forecast and saying, shouldn't our standard of living wouldn't our standard of living take a hit if we start charging for nature? The answer in the first approximation, the answer must be yes. You didn't pay for it before, now you're paying, so your cost of living has gone up. Goes without saying. So yes, your real income is going to go down, that's for sure. On the other hand, that might trigger innovations in the way we live, because innovations respond to relative prices, because the profitability of innovations depend on where the profits lie, quote unquote, and the profits are guided by prices. And so it's hard to predict which way innovations are going to take place. One reason, if you look at economic history, the innovations that have taken place have been very rapacious in the use of nature. Chainsaw is a very good example. Very rapacious. It, of course, saves on labor cost, and that's the whole idea. Labor is expensive, machines are expensive, but forests are not expensive, they're free. So obviously you have chainsaw or fishing trawler, these new methods of targeting schools of fish. That entire technology has been driven by the fact that fishing is free in the open seas for that activity. So of course you're going to, the entire chain of innovation is going to be directed against nature. And that's because the relative prices are wrong. So I think if we change our institutions, that brings about a change which you and I can't predict. But the changes have a rationale, they're based on relative scarcities. And then you can't predict what our lifestyles are likely to be. We'll make the best of it. But at least we'll be paying our way through life, which we have not been in recent decades.
Okay, thank you. Maybe this has already answered the next question, the last set of two questions, which is basically on a related issue. And the one is, would your research suggest that there are indeed limits to per capita growth in the world because of this inequality. And the related question from my colleague Nico from the Institute, well, there's a dispute now between the environmental-minded scientists saying, well, we need some degrowth, we need some lower growth rates to sustain the world, or is it maybe in relation to your last comments, anyway, no limits to growth, but we have to better growth, so to say.
On the whole, I have found the discussion on limits to growth and so forth very unhelpful, because the natural question to ask is growth in what? And if it is growth in material goods and services, or goods and services which require more of nature, then obviously there should be limits to that, by definition, because that's a finite object out there and we've already got. But on the other hand, the direction in which our lives will take, if we start paying for what we buy, if you like, or use, is unpredictable. And we may go into a world in which the composition of our consumption is such that output will be continuing to grow, even although we will not be impinging on nature. But I can't envisage, I can't describe what that world is like. Just as people in the 14th century couldn't have guessed what kind of a life you and I are leading today. We shouldn't be surprised by that. I think it's, I worry that, I don't find limits to growth a very useful thing. If somebody says the biosphere is finite, yes, that means something to me.
Okay.
And that might have a limit to the extent to which we can, be clever enough to dodge nature's finiteness. That I understand, because ecology is a science and it's telling me that you can't have alpha going to infinity. That's very, very important to bear in mind. Alpha can't go to infinity because it is finite limits, for the simple reason that, just like the second law of thermodynamics, there are ecological principles which say you cannot get it, you can't have a ever increasing output with the vanishing use of Mother Nature. Vanishing use of Mother Nature. That can't happen. So, but short of that, I think it's hard to know. Maybe our great-grandchildren will be much better off than we are. The standard of living. They'll say, God, what kind of lives did our ancestors live? They were terrible.
Okay, this gives some optimism at the end. So, Professor Dasgupta, very thanks for this very impressive presentation and also the very lively and interesting discussion.
Pleasure.
Thanks again. Let me also thank to the co-organizers from the Austrian National Bank and all the people behind making this possible. And I do hope that we will first, Professor Dasgupta, see you once in Vienna, and all the participants to see also on the next Global Economy lecture. Thanks a lot for participating and have a nice evening or day or whatever.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much.